So we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some common questions tonight that come up with horses, especially for those of you that might be maybe in closer to some communities, much more so than what I am in my location where I'm at here in Garden City. We're going to spend some time talking about facilities, because I think that's a pretty important part, especially if you don't have a lot of grass with horses. Touch on some manure management, and then some feeding and just some general things, some thoughts that I kind of want to share with you guys that I think I've learned maybe as we've kind of have our horses out here, and some things that we do to maybe help us in those areas. So one of the first questions that I think comes up for a lot of people on the horse side, and it may apply in some instances to the other livestock as well, but the first thing that I would recommend is that you check your local restrictions and regulations with livestock and horses, especially if you're in one of those areas where you've got this, less than 10 acres, maybe you've got some neighbors that are fairly close by. In a lot of counties, what you'll see is they've got them zoned differently. If you're agriculture, pretty much you can do, I would say, just about whatever you want to. There are some areas that in Finney County, we call them rural residential, and most of those are less than 10 acres. The number of animals that you can have if you have that designation usually is X number of livestock per acre, and that would apply, to 4-H projects as well as to horses, etc. In some cases, some of those areas are also zoned residential, and that becomes a little bit more of a challenge, especially if you're in there. One of the other things that we actually ran into is as we bought our property here in Garden City, and I consider ours to be fairly small for Western Kansas. We have a whole quarter that the house sets on, and so we're not necessarily on near the smaller acreage that some folks would be, but certainly smaller by Western Kansas standards. But one of the things I ran into was we bought the house, we kind of started to bring a few horses in, and what I found was we actually had our insurance policy that we had on the home and the home site there in the outbuildings was actually the same as what you'd have if you had a home in town. And so I could have that residential policy, but it restricted me to only having I think 2 horses per each member of the household. Well, I don't know how often they do these, but we were selected for an inspection, and they said, oh, you have way more livestock than what your policy should allow. We need to switch you from a residential policy to a farm and ranch policy. It was pretty simple, but it was something that kind of was just something that I hadn't thought of. So I wanted to make everybody aware that can also be a factor for you to kind of think about in terms of some restrictions that might apply. Different companies are probably different, but it is something to check into as well. So, back into this question of how many horses can I have? Well, the first thing I want to remind a lot of folks is that horse facilities aren't necessarily large. There's many professional horse facilities that are going to set on less than 10 acres. You can see an example of one down here. You look at all those outbuildings, the total footprint of that facility is probably less than 10 to 15 acres. That's with a large arena, some turnouts, round pens, stall barn, etc. The thing that you have to keep in mind with that is those horses are very intensively managed. They've got those facilities, stalls, turnouts, walkers, etc. For a lot of folks, that's probably, they may or may not want to manage those horses that intensively. So the other question that I think, begins to come up is, well, how many horses will my pasture support? And so that's really a function for me of, well, what's the intake requirement of the horses? How much forage will a horse require, both on a daily basis, and you can look at it on an annual basis or a growing season basis. And then we have to factor in what's the annual forage production. Now, in a state like Kansas, that varies dramatically. If you go from the western side of the state to the eastern side of the state, the big driver is going to be rainfall. Garden City, we may have areas where we're only producing 1,000 pounds of forage during the growing season. As you move over to McPherson County, that could be as well in excess of 2,000 pounds, for example. So quite a bit of variability there. We've also got a grazing management component. As you think about, the long-term viability of a pasture, that old rule of take half, leave half is something we need to also take into consideration when you start to factor in, okay, so I bought this property, how many horses can I have? How many horses, will this grass support? So the first part of that question is, well, how much can a horse eat? And this is one that surprises a lot of people. So if we look at, voluntary dry intake of forages, a lot of times the rule of thumb we throw out is 2% of body weight. The reality of it is there's quite a bit of range, especially with horses. And if you think of the many different types of horses, all the way from, say, POAs and smaller ponies, lighter weight horses, all the way to heavy draft horses, there's going to be some variability there. The range is actually 1.8 to well over 3% of body weight. 3% of body weight is a lot of forage. If you look at ponies, ponies are really interesting in a lot of ways, metabolically, but some ponies can consume up to over 5% of their body weight in forage per day. That's a lot of feed. So if we just use an 1,100-pound horse as an example, that horse is going to consume about 22 pounds of forage a day. And keep in mind, the range is all the way from 20 to 35 pounds of forage per day. So to put that in perspective, okay, we take that times 365, we get 8,030 pounds a year. That's 7 to 8 round bales of hay, depending on what those bales would weigh. So that's the amount of forage that it would take to sustain that horse at that 22 pounds or roughly 2% of body weight that they would need to consume. So the question you might be asking yourself, if you kind of say, well, I'm just going to turn these horses out on grass, look at that, that section of grass that you have, or that pasture that you have access to, and ask yourself, okay, how many round bales of hay would I get off of that grass? Okay, and that may give you some indication if that's only 1 or 2 bales. If you were to roll that up, it's probably not going to support one horse on an annual basis. But we'll do a little bit, extend this example out just a little bit more and make it a little bit more meaningful as well. So if we take that same, annual forage production number of 2,300 pounds per acre, maybe that's central Kansas, and we take 50% of that take half, leave half rule for this pasture, it comes to 1,150 pounds of forage per acre. That horse consumes that 22 pounds at 80,030 pounds per year. So we get about, if we just figured the 1,150 production during the growing season, we get 52 days of grazing off of an acre. Okay, if we did it on an annual basis, it would take almost 7 acres to sustain that horse for 1 year at that level of forage production. Now, the forage production in your area, that may vary considerably. The folks like in our county extension office, like Shad and Jeff, they can do a really good job of kind of dialing in for you what your annual forage production might be at your location, because it is going to vary across the state and even within county based on the different soils types that might be available to you. So let's talk a little bit about how we would use pastures with horses. And to me, it kind of comes into 2 categories. If you're in that situation where you've got that pasture that's, 10 to 20 acres, most of the time those smaller pastures are going to simply become turnout areas if you have horses. And to me, that means we're going to see some seasonal use during the grazing season. We're probably going to need to shut those horses up, maybe move them off of that grass for some period of time. And so to me, they essentially become turnout areas. If you get into larger pastures, like the situation where I'm in, where I've got a quarter that I can divide up into essentially 3 different pastures, that larger pasture, then we can get a longer term grazing system built out of that. Could it be potentially year round? In some cases. Now, the limitation with grazing year round, just like with cattle or any other livestock that we'd have, is there's going to be times of the year where that forage probably isn't going to meet the specific nutrient demands of those horses. And so that's something to keep in consideration as well. But we're going to need some supplementation to go along with that. So regardless of how we're using that pasture, whether it's a turnout area or it is a larger pasture where we're doing some longer term grazing, there's some unique things about horses in terms of how they graze that's very different from how cattle or even sheep or some other animals are going to graze the same grass. Horses are continuous selective grazers. That means they're going to graze throughout the day, and they're very selective about what plants they're going to consume. Horses, as a general rule, they'll graze 47 to 54% of the day, of the daylight hours. So about half of those, of an 8 to 10 hour day this time of year, those horses are going to be out there grazing. If you look at cattle, they roughly divide their day up into about thirds. So cattle graze about 30% of the daylight hours. The other 2/3 they're going to spend walking around and resting. So quite a bit of difference there between horses and cattle. The other thing about horses that most people are aware of, but we often, I think, kind of forget about a little bit, is if you look at the way a horse's mouth is designed, they're capable of grazing much, much closer to the ground with a forage species than other species of animals that are out there. Horses can clip grasses that they like right off at the crown. Okay, and so as I think about horses and how they graze a particular pasture, and I'll show you some examples of this from my pasture from this summer that'll give you a really good example. But with horses, it's really easy to be understocked and overgrazed. Okay, you don't have to have a large number of horses. You can be far below what the stocking density, carrying capacity would be for a particular tract of land, and those horses will selectively graze the areas that they like, and really in some instances do some damage to some of those areas if we're not careful. So it can be a challenge. So this is kind of a fence line comparison. This is my pasture where I split things in half. On the right hand side here, this is about a little less than 75 acres. It's kind of in this paddock the way it's separated. There were 5 mares on this pasture this summer. They really like the grass in this spot, and as you can see with that fence line comparison, they spent a lot of time there and grazed it off pretty short. So that's a really good example of what, and you can see the grass up there by that poly tank that's out there next to the oil well. There's still lots of standing forage that's available. It's just this was really desirable grass for those horses, and so in essence they overgrazed it. So that's one of the challenges that I think we often run into with horses, even in situations where they've got access to plenty large enough pastures to sustain them. So pasture management is going to become a bigger issue with horses. Just because of their grazing behavior, pasture management becomes much, much more challenging. The other thing that I found that's most people just don't fully appreciate is that horses don't really eat weeds or forbs. They have a very low preference for that. Now, cattle, if you turn cattle out onto a pasture, there are times of the year when many of the things that we would consider to be forbs that are less desirable in a pasture, cattle will consume those. Horses, they're going to walk right past a lot of those species that are out there. And so, setting up some sort of a pasture rotation or rest cycle where we're giving that pasture time to recover between bouts of grazing is one way to manage that. The other method that I use quite a bit on my place is mowing. As you think about, the horses do a really good job of grazing the grass. It is probably time consuming more than anything to go out in some of these tracts and just mow off those weeds. Essentially with that mower, that bush hog, applying some pressure, trying to do it at the right time before those weeds have gone to seed is kind of the approach I take. Another tool that we have in the arsenal would be to use some chemical and some application to spray those. Obviously they're, different products, different targets, the time that we do that. But all of those are really good tools. The other one that I didn't put on the slide, but I wanted to throw out here because it may apply to some folks that do have some smaller acreages is, co-species grazing. Horses are going to prefer the grasses. A lot of times I've used a set of heifers to come along and graze behind those brood mares during the growing season. And really just use the cattle in essence because they tend to select a little bit different diet than what those horses are going to do. It's not perfect, but I certainly think there's some benefits of that co-species grazing with the horses and cattle, because they do tend to select a little bit different species in the pasture. And if you're in a situation where you've got you know, maybe 1 or 2 horses on a small paddock, that might be something that you could potentially use as well. So we talked a little bit about, you know, the pasture management side, but the other part of it is, you know, if you can kind of see where I'm going with this, is that horses are just by nature very difficult to manage, both the horses and the grass. You know, just like other species, we've got forage availability and quality, that we're trying to balance that with the nutrient demands of the horses. If you look at the way that horses graze, there's just simply going to be some times where the best thing for us, especially on smaller acreages, is going to be to have a means or a place to keep those horses off of that grass for some period of time, especially if you've got that smaller tract of land. So some facilities are really essential, I think, as I start to look at. Now, there's lots of different types, as we talk about stalls, covered pens, dry lots, etc. And that's what I thought really might be helpful for some people, especially if they're new to horses, was spending a little bit of time, you know, maybe discussing some of the things I've learned, what are some of the minimum space requirements, and maybe some other considerations as you start to look at maybe building some facilities to keep some horses off of that grass. So, you know, once again, look at the different types of facilities that are kind of outlaid in this overlay of this horse facility. We've probably got, you can see my pointer, which you may be able to, the stall barn here. We've got some covered areas here with some turnouts, stall barns, etc. Some larger, maybe dry lot pens that don't necessarily have. And we've also got some equipment and hay storage over here. So even on a smaller operation, there are elements that are on this larger facility that are certainly some important considerations for I think even a smaller horse owner that's not going to have near the intensive operation that's shown here. So I want to talk a little bit about stalls. 12 by 12 is probably the most common size for horses. In a lot of buildings that we put up or that may be pre-existing on a barn, that's, if you're using something that was already built, most of the time the stall spacing is a function of where they put the posts and what the center is on those. And so, you know, I've seen stalls, and the stalls in my barn are actually a little less than 11 feet for some reason, and that's quite small. I'd rather have them be a little bit larger. Now, obviously, if you have smaller horses, if you're doing the miniatures or the ponies, you can get by with quite a bit smaller facility. The other thing to consider is, well, if you're going to have brood mares and babies, you know, having some sort of a foaling stall or a place to bring those mares in the early spring weather conditions in Kansas, even in April, it's not uncommon to see a snowstorm, right? And so a lot of times, if you have built a facility, if you are going to have mares and foals, a lot of times building one of those stalls, regardless of the size, with a removable divider that you can take out or either put on hinges and fold back out of the way, can be a good idea if that's something you intend to do. Probably the most common size, as you look at different barns, is that 12 by 24 foaling stalls. Pretty common. You'll see in some particular facilities, thoroughbred facilities especially, that do a lot of mares, you'll see a lot of 16 by 16 stalls. This is the standard in the barns. I've seen that in some particular facilities. As we think about dividers, you know, between the stalls, there's lots of different stall configurations that you can buy. You can go online, you can look at lots of different plans. One of the things that always concerns me about some of those is the dividers between the stalls are fairly low. In my experience, you want those to be fairly high. I would say 7 foot plus. It was beneficial. 6 foot is you know, anything a horse can get its head over usually is something they're either going to think about, either interacting with the horse on the other side of them, or maybe even potentially, you know, trying to go over. I'd also recommend that it be solid at the sides on the bottom. Most of the packages that you're going to see out there are solid. You know, horses, as you stall them, especially if they've been in the stalls for 2 to 3 days when the weather's bad, especially show horses that are, getting fed a pretty high octane ration. They're going to kick at those walls and do some other things. So making sure they're solid and substantial enough to be able to take that, et cetera, is, I think, a pretty important consideration. You'll see some folks that'll use plywood. I'm not a really big fan of that. I've seen facilities that were lined with plywood. Plywood's pretty easy to kick through. You'd be surprised that does happen. So I much prefer, like what's shown here, of using the 2x6s or maybe even the larger framing lumber to build those stalls out of. Another important consideration is the flooring. And this isn't something that I used to think really too much about. We always use clay as the basis of the bottom of our stalls. As my daughters and I have gotten into the show horses a little bit more, we typically have 2 to 3 show horses in the barn. Keeping them clean, especially during the winter, and with the bedding, we've gone to stall mats, and I think the big advantage there is we seem to use far less bedding than what we were doing before we used the stall mats. There's a lot of different configurations. I know people that have actually essentially dug a dry well in the middle of the stall and then perforated the stall mat so that any of the moisture can drain away. There's lots of different recipes, but I think at the end of the day, investing some money in the flooring system and stall mats really comes down to being able to save some bedding material in those stalls. So another option for a horse facility to pull those horses off of grass is to build a dry lot or a turnout system. Typically, the textbook recommendation is 400 to 500 square feet per horse is recommended. I would also suggest maybe incorporating a shelter into that. Normally, a 12 by 12 shelter is going to accommodate 1 to 2 horses. If you want to have more than that, a 12 by 24 is recommended for 2 to 4 horses. You really have to consider the horse type. What is that horse going to do? How are you going to use that facility? Once again, coming back to, are these just, riding horses, or are you looking at something that's going to be mares and foals? Another big consideration with the dry lots, especially as you're looking at a larger pen space, is, well, how are you set up to clean that particular pen? Just like in any other livestock operation, the equipment that you're going to use to clean that facility is pretty important. Are you going to clean that by hand? If you're going to use a tractor with the blade, are you going to make the gates wide enough that you can get that piece of equipment in there? I would always advise making it the gates wide enough so that you can access it with the tractor, just simply because you're going to have to come in and do some pen surface repair at some point. So I actually have a set of runs on the property I have today that all they have is a 4-foot walk-through gate on them. Very difficult to get any sort of piece of equipment in there to move any dirt or gravel back into those pens. So that's an important consideration. The picture at the bottom, there's a couple of runs that I've built on the left-hand side. Those pens are about 50 by 100. They work really well for 1 to 2 horses. That's kind of where I designed them. That far exceeds the 400 to 500 that's recommended per horse. But if you look at the space, 1 to 2 horses does fairly well. A mare and a foal, that's a good amount of space for them to turn out. That foal can move around. The other thing that I like about this particular pen size and that 50 by 100, that's about the largest pen that you can clean by hand effectively. We can do a pretty good job on the manure side of that pen if we go in and clean it by hand once every couple of days. A lot of times we'll use a tractor and a 10-foot speed mover blade. You can see the shelter on the bottom. I use the lumber on the bottom. Sheet metal and horses and legs don't mix, in my opinion. There's lots of veterinary accidents. If you're interested, I'd be more than happy to share kind of how we constructed that facility. But that's essentially a 12 by 12 shelter for each side of that pen with the gate in the middle. We've got feed doors on the back side. So just an example of something that works pretty well, simple monoslope structures there as well. And so the other piece of a horse facility, especially where we know we're going to have to feed those horses off of the grass, and I think a lot of people, especially on smaller acreages, often don't think about is hay storage. You know, if how are you going to store your hay? What's your hay type? Are you going to try to just exclusively use the small square bales? All those are super convenient, but they're pretty expensive, right? They don't require a whole lot of equipment. A couple of things that I've seen used pretty well for the small squares are the shipping containers. Obviously, you may have an aversion to those, setting on your property, but they do work well. They're pretty cost-effective structures in terms of feed structures. If you're looking, as you look at building things, you'll see various configurations you can look at where, folks have put a roof around them or use them as partial windbreaks on the side of a facility. As you get into the larger squares and the round bales, the bigger disadvantage of those is you've got to have some sort of equipment to handle them. There's a lot of, most people on smaller acreages, we tend to have smaller tractors, and that kind of becomes one of the limitations. If you take a 3x4 square of alfalfa, it's not uncommon for those bales to weigh 1,900 or 2,000 pounds on the alfalfa side. So, the hay storage piece of that, I see a lot as you drive across the countryside like I do in my extension work. You see a lot of things, tarps across hay bales, and if you look at the amount of dollars that you invest in hay, especially for horses, I think it warrants maybe giving some consideration to the storage and how you're going to handle that hay ultimately. Manure is also a really big factor, especially if you have neighbors and they're fairly close to you. That can be a problem for many horse owners. It happens, but what are you going to do with it? If you think about one stalled horse, you're going to produce about 12 tons of stall waste per year. So that's manure, bedding, all of that stuff. That's going to be pretty wet because you've got the urine in there. But you don't think about that horse producing 12 tons of waste per year. That's a lot of bulk that you're going to have to get rid of. So there's some common methods that can be used. Stockpiling is probably the most common. That's where you remove the manure from the pens and you simply pile it up. Usually over time, the mass of that manure starts to compress as the hay and the other components of it and maybe the shavings start to break down a little bit. That's the method that we use at our house out of the stalls. We will stockpile our manure for quite a while. We use that in cattle feedlots as well. It's not uncommon for us to stockpile manure there. And really what you're doing is you're increasing the nutrient density of that. And then most of the time it's not too difficult to find maybe a neighbor that's willing to bring in a piece of equipment and maybe haul that off for you that you can work with them. I've even paid for a spreading company to come in and haul our manure off and spread it on a neighbor. So I covered all the cost and we just applied it to his field. Another method that's out there is on the left-hand side is composting. Now true composting is where you build the bays, you aerate it with a tube. Works very, very well with horse manure, especially if you've got shavings because you've got the carbon source. There's probably the best publication that I've found is this from the University of Massachusetts that talks about composting horse manure. This picture was taken from that publication. That's actually built out of used pallets and some lumber and some PVC tubes that are used to aerate that. The other method that it's pretty common if you have some acreage that you can spread on or neighbors that may farm would be to spread that manure. And probably one of the most handiest pieces of equipment that I invested in was a ground-driven manure spreader. And this thing is circa 1940s. I spent about 3 months one winter kind of completely restoring this one and going through the bearings. I wouldn't call it an antique restoration. It's a functional restoration. But we use this spreader quite a bit. I picked up this spreader for $600 from the original owner. I probably spent maybe close to $1,500 to $2,000. Those tires on the side are pretty expensive, I found out. But just invest, and that's become a very handy piece of equipment for us. It's an old International 200. You can back it into the barn. The downside with it is for the tractor I use, it really only takes about 2 scoops from the loader to fill that thing up. But it does allow us to spread that manure over the acres that we have. There are more modern versions of these that you can buy. Some you can pull with a 4-wheeler. There's others that are designed very similar to this one that are designed to be pulled with a truck or a tractor. But certainly a good piece of equipment to have or think about if you're going to have any significant number of horses at all on the place. So the other thing that I thought might be helpful was to talk a little bit about feeding horses and in particular feeding hay. You know, as I look at my operation and the horses we have, hay is a big part of that. It's a big expense for us, etc. So with horses, we often think about forage first, and I think it was one of the major nutrition companies used to have a slogan. That's what they put on the sides of the sack with their horse line of products was forage first. That's a really good concept because with horses, forage is really going to be the foundation of any horse program. Typically, as we think about concentrates, you know, we're only going to use those to supplement those horses as needed based on the age of the horse. So as you think about young growing animals all the way to mature animals, and then maybe those mares that may have foals at side, you know, as you get into the stage of production. The other thing with horses is we feed them based on work intensity. So there's a big difference between the energy requirements of a horse at maintenance. Those are fairly low if it's a mature horse. And then a horse that we might be training for cutting. That's probably, you know, we may have them out there, it's 30 to 35 minutes, but it's a very intense workout. So we need to feed those horses very differently than we would feed those horses at maintenance. As a general rule of thumb, horses need about 0.75 to 1% of body weight in some sort of long stem forage per day. There's 2 reasons behind that. One, biggest one is gut health, and the other one is behavioral issues. The biggest way to prevent any sort of stable vices, wood chewing, kind of cribbing, etc., any of the stable vices that we think of with horses is simply giving them something to do during the day, and having that forage out there in front of them is going to be a big part of that. So if you think about that 1,100-pound horse, that's a minimum of 11 pounds of forage per day for those horses. So I alluded to this before. You know, the reason I want to talk about hay is hay for me, and I track my costs fairly closely. We spend a lot of money as horse owners for hay. We tend to buy quality hay. We pay for that quality. The other piece of that is, you know, we're oftentimes looking at the small square bales. So how do we address the waste issue? You know, and that comes back, one, it increases our costs. The other side of it, where I look at it, and I've especially noticed it with round bale feeders, where we've got, you know, 1 or 2 horses in a small pen, we put out a round bale, and that may last us several days, maybe even a week or so. As those horses pull it out of the feeder, what happens is we get more bulk in the pen that we have to remove. If you're in one of those areas where you've got neighbors that are fairly close to you and the wind blows, what happens to the hay? Well, it blows out and it's all across your neighbor's yard, and then they're kind of unhappy with you. So I wanted to maybe address some of the different horse feeders that are out there for hay, and then I'll kind of talk about a couple methods that I found that work pretty well for us in our environment. So one of the things that's become more common is these hay nets shown up here on the left-hand side of the screen, where you can take that hay, maybe even fork it off of a round bale and put it into these slow feeder nets. They've got different size mesh that horse will essentially chew on throughout the day. We used to have hay nets, you know, we put in trailers, and I see these as just maybe a little more durable type of these. You know, they're made to hold several pounds of hay that are out there. I've got a friend in New Mexico that uses these and he says they work pretty well. They can either be hung from the fence. You'll see some folks that'll put them in some sort of a feeder. You will see pictures on the internet of some folks that are throwing them out there in the pen just loose. I have some reservations about doing that, just because as that hay gets eaten down, they may get their feet entangled with it. They do also make these hay nets that will encompass an entire round bale. It's more of a sleeve. You can fold over those round bales and put them in the feeder that's out there. and really all they're trying to do is just restrict access to those horses to that feeder. You've kind of got a variation of the tub feeder on the sides and the center there. Once again, probably works pretty well in terms of feeding loose hay. The classic horse feeder for small square bales is shown on the far right hand side with the younger horses there. This is what everyone pictures when they see a horse hay feeder, is something like that. However, in my experience, and I've been involved in 2 different horse farms, both at K-State, at New Mexico State, and in our own operation growing up, we see a little more waste with these type feeders than what one would expect. Especially in areas where we get more wind and we feed grass hay. As that horse reaches up to pull out of that feeder, what happens? The leaves blow away and we do lose some content there. The other area of concern is you think about horses and hay feeders being positioned up. If there's any dust in that hay, what happens to that? Where is that horse going to draw that dust into? Right into their nasal passages. Maybe in a perfect world where we've got good clean hay, that's not an issue. But if you have an older horse that has some respiratory issues, I think that I would much prefer that horse to be eating their hay with their head down, to where they can kind of pick and we're not getting all of that dust. So on the bottom, this is how I feed hay and at our operation. That on the in terms of our round bale feeders, these are kind of a custom design. Keep in mind, I live in western Kansas, where the wind blows most days. So one of my biggest losses, even on the mares, I felt like was just simply due to wind loss. And so this is a 60-inch feeder. So at the top there, it has a 30-inch solid steel skirt around it that we'll put those bales in. I even use these to feed 3x4 large squares. They'll fit just inside there. They're pretty tight, but you can get them in, so they do work for that. But usually this is a small turnout pasture where I fed horses one winter, and you can see there's not a whole lot of hay waste around the sides of this feeder as well. So most of it stays pretty contained. We do see some hay waste with it because it's certainly not perfect. As you look at feeding hay that's going to last for multiple days, the easiest way to restrict hay waste is to simply feed a 1-day supply. Feed it by hand. That's true with cattle. That's probably true with any livestock, and I think the same holds true with horses. The other thing that we use quite a bit is the recycled tire tubs, where they take the front wheel assist tractors tires and they turn them inside out and then cut that sidewall out. We found that these work really well. They're portable. We rotate the mares on grass. This is kind of what you see here as they move across our place, and so we'll take and feed that hay and flake it off to those mares in those tire tubs. The concern you could have here, you can have a situation where some horses may step in that feeder if you have a young foal or a yearling. Most of the time, in my experience, they do get back out, but there is that potential that they may step into it as well. You can also flake loose hay from a round bale off into these tubs. In general, the cost, most of the time, these can be picked up. They are a little bit more difficult to find than what they used to be. Usually $50 to $60, depending on the size of that tire tub, is what you can pick up some of those type feeders for. But in my experience, they work really well for a wide variety of situations. So one of the other areas where I think we see some issues with horses as well is the largest problems we see with horses nutritionally is we see horses that are either under-conditioned or over-conditioned. And so it's worthy of spending some time and talking about, how do we tell when a horse is thin and we need to maybe increase the level of nutrition? How do we tell when maybe they're getting over-conditioned and we need to change our nutrition program a little bit? And so just like with cattle, we have a body condition scoring system that's been developed. Essentially goes from 3 to 9. Here you can see 3 to 8 is what's laid out here. This was developed a number of years ago, back in the early 80s at Texas A&M by Henneke and others. The system works really well. Essentially what we're looking at, just like with cattle, is fat deposits. 5 is kind of our ideal condition on a horse, the riding horse, etc., or a broodmare. And so to just give you some visual representation of what these would look like, I've got some pictures of horses, both from a side profile and down their back, of conditions all the way from 3, 5, and 8. If you look at the horse that's a 3, this is a horse we'd look at, you know, they're not excessively thin, but they're certainly on the thinner side where we'd like to put a little more condition on them. You can easily see the ribs. As you look down their top line, they don't have a positive crease. They've got a negative crease to their back as well. As we move to that gilding there, that's a 5. We no longer see the ribs along the side. We get to see the fat deposits. They start to fill out along their croup next to their tail head. That's probably where we'd like to see a lot of our horses. This is what I would consider to be ideal, is that horse that's in a 5. And then we move to the other end of the extreme of those horses that are getting pretty fleshy, and where maybe there may be some certainly some over conditioning that's there. As you look at that horse, you know, she's getting cresty through her neck. You can see the fat deposits back around her tail head where they get those little bubbles up there. Certainly got a positive crease. It's certainly a horse that, you know, if you were feeding that horse, you know, 6 pounds of grain and 12 pounds of alfalfa a day, we need to change that program up a little bit just for the longevity and even the usefulness of that horse. So those are some of my thoughts that I hope kind of helped you all as you look at horses, and so we by no means touched on all of the issues with horses. There's a lot of different directions, but I promised Shad I'd try to keep the presentation around 30 to 35 minutes. Looks like we've gone over by a little bit here, Shad, so sorry about that, but certainly be happy to entertain any questions that you have, and hopefully you got some useful information out of it. So Chad, any questions, I guess?
I do. I have a couple of questions here, and I just one person asked the difference between prairie hay and brome hay as it pertains to forage, and we know that there's a protein difference, a crude protein, that if brome is put up right and highest quality, you know, it's more beneficial to the horse. Prairie hay is, if it's put up in good quality, it's lower than brome, but if it's put up even, you know, in later in maturity, then it's even lower, and maybe not even enough to be sufficient for that horse, especially a mare that's nursing or something like that with a foal. So tell me what your difference between, there's a lot of horse people around here that like to feed brome.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, what it comes back to with all the forages is actually trying to find the forage that fits the horse's requirements. You know, as you see, so, you know, a lot of people tend to prefer brome and grass hays for horses over alfalfa. You know, as you move into central Kansas, one of the biggest concerns with alfalfa is blister beetles. That's legitimate. Okay, that happens. So I think that's why you see a lot of people maybe gravitate towards brome. And the brome can certainly be of higher quality. But there are a lot of horses, especially as you move west, where alfalfa is used quite extensively in horse diets. You'll see some people say, well, can I feed alfalfa to a horse? Yeah, absolutely. It's just, you know, most of the time where we do have concerns over blister beetles, there is some risk there. But you know, the preference for the grass hays, I guess I'm more of a fan of, you know, feed what kind of fits the horse. There's actually some hays out there that work. You know, horses don't necessarily need a hay that's going to be 15-20% crude protein, right? We've also got to balance the energy side of that. So a lot of times, as we look at, you know, mature horses, the bromes that are going to be 7, 8, maybe a little higher percent in terms of the crude protein value are sometimes a better fit for those. Does that answer the question, Shad? Or?
Yep, I think so, yes. Okay, next. We saw that on your fence line where you had the overgrazed. Yeah, how much damage is that done there?
So, Yeah, that's a really good question, and might be able to go back to that. But you know, the real answer to that is I took those mares off of there. You know, I should have probably pulled them off earlier. It'll be, you know, I do live in short grass, so you know, rainfall is a big factor. If we go into a dry year, there's probably going to be more damage there. If we get a wet spring, that grass is pretty hardy and will likely recover. In a perfect world, you know, that's just one of the things you deal with horses, and that's a pretty good example of it. You know, they overgraze that patch, but there's 6 to 10 inches of grass up the hill a little ways. So I think long term it's pretty hard to tell what the actual damage would be if I'd have pulled. There will be some probably damage to that particular location. We'll see. You know, the biggest problem that I see in my pasture is I may have a weed problem in those areas in the next coming year or so. So if we get out there, do some spraying and mitigate it, some spot spraying in those areas, that's how I try to deal with those, is head them off a little bit, because I know there are going to be problems, especially if I get rainfall. So.
You bet. Now that our native pastures, or our pastures here, they're dormant. So if the cattle are out there grazing, or the animals are out there grazing, we probably don't really hurt this late. But they're in the fall. When we were grazing them, grass is really, really short. That's what them grasses make that starch and make that sugar, then they carry that down to the roots and they store that for the winter. And so anytime that we're cutting that grass that short, then we're hurting that grass potential for later on. Now, does that mean that it's always damaged? No. You know, with some rainfall and some luck and some things like that in the spring, when we have some spring rains, that could but we're sure have the possibilities that we could be damaged.
Yep, absolutely. And you know, you said it best, you know, dormant forage right now, you know, you can hit it pretty hard and graze it off, and you know, we start to think about catching snowfall out here, but rainfall is a big part of that. So
yeah, and I want everyone to know that's listening, there is a big difference of what we see in grasses in western Kansas than what we have here just west of the Flint Hills. And so you know, I have some Charolais breeders that come and drive through the cows, and they see that grass that's, you know, there in May and June, it's 3 foot tall. And no, that buffalo grass where in Oakley, where they're from, I mean, that's short, but it's hardy, and that's just a different grass in part of the state. So
yeah, and
a couple
the
of
other
questions.
thing
No, go on.
that illustrates that too is, you know, if you test some of the short grass in western Kansas in a dry year, it's not uncommon for us to see that dormant native grass be at 9% protein in a drought year. And so that's very different than what you'd see on the other side of the state potentially. So.
That's correct. Yeah. Next question would be, okay, I do want to remind everybody, if you look at your chat box, Jeff has a link there that you click on, and you can perform our survey. And we want everybody to do that. It's just takes you 30 seconds to do the survey. But that really helps us out. And so please, everybody, click on that link and it goes right to that survey. You can do that while you're listening here. Linda says, we've been breaking our 20 acres into paddocks and rotating our horses. Oh, it's only 20 acres. They've been rotating their horses every 1 to 2 days. Now we are introducing some cows. Do you suggest anything different in our rotation? Also, we have prairie grass. How can I keep my endurance horses in good nutrition on prairie grass? Thanks for your insight.
Hey. So there's 2 parts to that question. So, you know, as you think about 20 acres, you know, I would tell you, you know, first, even with the rotation, you know, keep in mind, visit with Shad and those folks to see what your stocking rate would be. You know, how many animals can you sustain? I think there's a good benefit of having that rotation. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not how many days the animals are on the grass, it's actually how many days they're off. And that varies depending on, you know, if you're in the growing season, you're getting rainfall, the grass is growing rapidly. You know, that's a different situation than where you're at this time of year, where that grass is dormant. You know, you could potentially maybe spend a little bit more time on the rotation because you're not getting any new growth. As you know, but even with the, you know, say you're introducing the cattle with the horses, you still got, you know, the same, you still got, you know, animals that are out there consuming forage. So it still comes back to how much forage does the animal require and how much is it going to produce. So, you know, I think that's, you know, the rotation is good, but keep it, you know, just keep in mind what that total forage production is really going to look like relative to what you need. I'd even still, I think there's likely going to be times, especially even with the rotation, that, you know, having a place to pull those animals off of there for some part of the year at times is going to be beneficial for you. As you look at so we talked a little bit about the endurance horses. You're certainly in that category of a horse that's going to be working a little bit harder than the others. What I would encourage you to do with that is, you know, you talk about prairie grass. Well, the big thing with the working horses and the endurance horses is you've got to balance energy and protein and then all the other electrolytes. And we don't talk, you know, we didn't dig very deep into horse nutrition, but you could dial it down to specific amino acids as you get into other things. So, you know, as you look at those horses that are kind of on the extreme of the inventing side, it's pretty difficult to maintain those horses just exclusively on a particular forage base. You know, it's going to require, you know, some sort of concentrate to go with that. A really good resource for looking at horse nutrient requirements is the Nutrient Requirements of Horses. It's a book. You can buy it on Amazon. It's kind of like the Bible of horse nutrition. You can preview that. It's really kind of set up like a textbook. It is in metric units. That's probably the biggest downfall of it, but it'll give you the specific requirements for different intensities of work at a specific weight and class of horse. And so that can be a really good guide. And the way I usually tell people to use that is, you know, you can look at the absolute grams of protein per day that horse needs, but probably what's more meaningful sometimes is to look at the maintenance requirement for that class of horse, and then look at what the intense workload and how big of an increase that is. The other part of that is using the body condition scoring system on your horses. You know, if that endurance horse, if he's below a 5, you know, we certainly need to increase the energy density, possibly the diet. You know, protein, really, those requirements, they increase some, but not near the extent that the energy is going to on those horses. The other thing we could get into, you know, different types of energy, you know, supplements, and especially those horses. You know, a lot of professional horse trainers and stuff will use, you know, fats and lipids as energy sources, etc. And so they, you know, get into, you know, more specific, you know, the types of calories and how those are going to impact the horse as you get into some of those events. But I would encourage you to take a look at some of the nutrient requirements of horses. You can preview that book online. Probably one of the best textbooks on horse nutrition is a book by Lon Lewis. It's getting a little dated now, but there's also some really good stuff in that particular book as a reference to just kind of help you with horse nutrition and feeding programs. And it's written a little more for the horse owner's perspective, I would think.
Okay. Yeah. And there, you know, I'm not a horse person, but when you go visit a horse farm, they all feed very high quality hay, and they all supplement them, you know, especially the working horses. They all supplement them with, you know, feeding them twice a day with some kind of a grain supplement, just like Justin said, to increase their energy for that. Next question is, what is an efficient way to find someone local to really help decide what is the best course of action to get the healthiest pastures from our area to then develop a rotational system for 40 acres in eastern Kansas?
Well, in my opinion, where I would start is with the guys like Shad. The local county extension folks is a, great place to start. They may bring in some NRCS folks eventually. The other thing is, I think it's also important to recognize the challenge. As you look at, rotational grazing systems are challenging even if you've got 3 sections. As a beef cattle specialist, as you look at building those rotations, dividing the paddocks, differences in topography, how cattle are going to use the slopes, those get more complex, and Shad may have, they get more complex as you get smaller, which is they're complex on a larger scale, but as you go down to 80 acres, that's pretty complex. But then as you go down to 40, then it just becomes more challenging, because sometimes the number of animal units we have, and if the forage production slows up, say due to lack of rainfall, oh man, our whole rotation rest system is just kind of derailed. What do we do? So recognize that those are complex, and certainly I'd recommend starting with local county extension agent, looking at the NRCS, looking at the estimated forage production values for your soil type, your area, and your rainfall. But not only looking at it at average rainfall, but look at it of what it looks like when you're in D3 drought status, which sometimes that's not much, right? So that's the other piece to that as well. Here's the what if. Here's the best case scenario, but also the worst case scenario as well. So.
And that can change in a season. I mean, that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Just with one grazing season, that could change, because, this year we were dry, and then we were, last year, the last couple of years, we were so dry. And then this year we had some early rains. We had some rain in July, and then it got dry when we started planting wheat in August, September, October, and we were dry again. And so it can be that in a season. And the problem with the horse people is sometimes they don't have a lot of acres, and so that cuts our ability to, when a person has more acres, they seem they can find more ways of getting through some of them problem areas. And when you don't have that, then you have to do something different.
Yeah, and being prepared to pull off of it, even in a more extensive rotational system, is, you can only go back and graze the pasture you've already grazed. You can only speed up the amount of your rotation so much to some point if your forage production is pretty slow. So there's challenges there for sure.
Don't forget to take the survey for us, and if you have any more questions, you can get on here live and talk, or you can type it in the chat room. We'll stay here just for a little bit, and if we have some more questions. I want to thank Justin for his expertise, and what a great, just a vast knowledge that he has. And if you call me and ask me a question, guess who I'm calling? Dr. Waggoner will be, he'll get an email or a telephone call to make sure that what I'm saying is right. And he's just he's lived it, so he's went through this. His schooling has been into horse nutrition, and he's an excellent source here. We appreciate that.
Yeah, I never realized that I was setting out to build a horse facility, but that's kind of where my daughters have steered me. So.
Yep. One thing we didn't talk much about: how often do you worm horses?
It depends. So the younger horses that are going to be up in the dry lots, we've got 5 weanlings right now. You know, I will worm them, and there are recommendations out there, but as you look at that, there's you know, the type of horse, the environment they're in, you know, there's schedules you can look up. I tend to be fairly aggressive with it on the younger horses, just simply because they spill the grain out of their tubs, they eat hay off of the ground, and so we'll worm them, especially through their weanling year, you know, fairly often. So, you know, that may be usually coming into the fall. We'll worm them when they come in with an ivermectin. We'll switch to a different type of wormer, and then hit them again about 60 days later. And then once again in the spring starting. As you get to mature horses, if they're out on pasture, you could probably get away with doing that, you know, 2 to 3 times a year, maybe less, if you look at those recommendations. But you know, if you're in that pretty intensive environment, I'd, you know, get with your veterinarian. You want to rotate the wormer products. One of the things that I have seen that I do like now, if you know, shop at Valley Vet, one of the things you'll see is they've got the rotational horse worming package kind of built. So it used to be you had to buy a case of one wormer and a case of the next time. Well, now they started combining them. And so you know, I think that's a really good idea to help people get in that system of rotating wormers. I know I've certainly gotten a situation where I had some horses with issues with a particular worm because I'd basically hit them with an ivermectin type wormer, you know, that wasn't effective against that class of worms.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.